Good morning, everybody. I'm very happy to introduce the second day of the third biennial CARGC Symposium. I want to thank our speakers yesterday, Rafia, Shireen, and Ahmed for a very exciting and provocative and interesting opening session. I'm going to repeat a few things that I said yesterday because we have people in the audience who might not have been here with us. Let me say a few words about CARGC. CARGC, as I mentioned yesterday, produces and promotes scholarly research on global communication and public life. We are an institute for advanced study dedicated to global media studies, in which we revisit enduring questions and engage pressing matters in geopolitics and communication. As I mentioned yesterday, our vision is that of inclusive globalization that recognizes both plurality and inequality in the field. We have what we call a translocal approach that fuses multidisciplinary regional knowledge, what we used to call area studies, with interdisciplinary inquiry. We talked about how our commitment is for early career scholars, particularly doctoral students and postdocs. And we host symposia, lectures, colloquia, so on and so forth. I want to introduce the members of Team CARGC for this year. First of all, of course, Marina Krikorian, who is the logistical and strategic linchpin of all of this. So Marina will give you an Marina has been with the center from day one. We also have doctoral fellows, research fellows, and postdoctoral fellows. Is Yasamin here? Their names are on the program. Bulai is a research fellow. Where's Bulai? Hi, Bulai. Raya's here. She's our postdoctoral fellow. Heather is a doctoral fellow at CARGC. Revati, hi. She's a doctoral fellow. Samira, hi, Samira is our second postdoc. And then we have Hamad is here, who's a doctoral fellow, and Celeste, who's also a doctoral fellow. And we also have a couple of incoming fellows who will join us next year. Zain is here, who will start with us in the fall. Hi, Zain. And is Zubaida in the room? Hi, Zubaida. Zubaida is our incoming undergraduate fellow for next year. Our research themes and groups include things like theory and history in global media studies, where we try to trace back the sort of why the field developed in the way it has. We have a research group on geopolitics of the popular that looks at how popular culture, the arts, comedy get imbricated in geopolitics. We're starting a new research group on the notion of digital sovereignty that will kick off formally in the fall. And of course, we have this research group, the research group that prepared for this symposium, the so-called Jihadi Networks of Culture and Communication Group, JINX, which is in our theme. One of our themes is communicating radicalism, radical communication, and this is the group. So we have several people who've been with us for a couple of years in JINX. I'm going to introduce them very quickly. Brian, is Brian in the room? Hi, Brian. Of course, Heather, I already mentioned. John Villanova, who's not with us today. Karim is here. Where's Karim? Hi, Karim. Katrina, who's not here because she's struggling. She's not struggling. She finished her dissertation. She's revising the final product, so she's not here. Michael DeGerald, who's a PhD student at the University of Washington, is in the same boat. He's finishing his dissertation. He's defending in a few weeks, like Katrina, so they're not here. This is what I love to hear, people who get involved at CARGC and finish on time. Muhammad is here. We also have Rosemary Pennington from Miami University of Ohio and William Yeomans from George Washington University, who are not here with us today, and then Yara, who's here with us from Beirut. Where's Yara? Hi, Yara. Welcome. So JINX has published about a dozen papers. You can find them. It's an ISIS media series that we edited. It was published by the University of California at Santa Barbara on their global e-portal. If you look ISIS media, UCSB on Google, you'll find it. I also want to mention briefly what inspires me to work on this research group and this colloquium. And the inspiration was an Andrew Carnegie Fellowship that enabled me to spend 2 years thinking and plotting and researching and writing and involving other people in doing the same about Islamic State, trying to think of it through the trope of the war machine. So I want to thank the foundation. I also want to thank the Middle East Center at Penn and Perry Worldhouse, who are our co-sponsors. Perry Worldhouse decision came a little too late to be on the program, but they're an equal co-sponsor of all of this. And finally, I want to thank most of all Michael Deli Carpini, our dean, who, as I said yesterday, has been proactively and generatively supportive of everything we've tried to do at PARG and then at CARG. Thanks, Michael. Yes. I also want to thank a group of people who we don't thank enough, just the Annenberg staff. This is a beast to put together. For the belly of the beast to operate, a lot of people have been working for a very long time, particularly the last 48 hours. And I want to thank a few of you. Hopefully I won't forget anybody. If I do, please remind them that I thank them as well. I want to thank Deb Porter and Jamal Hampton, who keep the building humming. Security Officer Ralph was here this morning at 6 a.m. to wait for the caterer. He came shortly before Marina showed up. Waldo and Kyle, who are immortalizing the event in photos and video. Our Director of Communication, Julie Sloan, and her team, Ashton, and Corey, who's behind the fabulous poster design. We didn't get clouds today, thankfully, but we tried. Finally, I would like to thank the students, all the staff I haven't thanked, who keep showing up to our events, who keep prodding us in all the right directions. This brings me to the substance of the symposium. So one of the most sort of geopolitical, one of the most profound and alarming crises of the last decade, which has been one of the extremely turbulent decades, more so than anybody had predicted. If you remember, not too long ago, we were talking about the end of history and the end of ideology and all these things. Was the rise of Islamic State, right? An organization that had about 7 or 8 names in a matter of a couple of years, and then declared itself an Islamic State tout court with ambitions to be global, to be boundaryless. It began in the wake of the US-UK invasion of Iraq in 2003, a fact that we need to remember. It ebbed and flowed with the Iraqi insurgency. It reemerged in war-torn Syria. It had at its height a territory the size of Great Britain. It had outposts all the way to the Philippines and Libya. We can talk a lot about this. Just want to share a factoid. In 2015, the Pew Charitable Trust did a global survey, and both North Americans, Europeans at large, and people in the Middle East thought that ISIS was the #1 threat to global order. That was July 2015. Since then, the threat has been declared gone. I think it's a huge mistake. November 2017, we had declarations from the Iraqi Prime Minister, from the President of the United States, a bunch of European leaders, including Theresa May, that the threat is gone. The threat is not gone. The threat is regrouping. Those of us who are following what's going on know that, and hopefully we can try to figure out why that is the case. So we know that journalists, think tank, and government analysts were ahead of us academics in producing knowledge and data about this group. There was a tsunami of papers, of policy briefs. If you're like me, it was really a struggle to keep up with the volume of publications. At some point, I felt I was reading about 100 pages a day on different kinds of things related to ISIS, coming from think tanks from all over the world. Yet, as the Mauritanian diplomat and Swiss academic Mohamed Mohamedou has written, social sciences have so far failed to initiate what he calls a historically contextualized, a global, not merely Western-based, and a nuanced discussion of Islamic State. Perhaps it's still too early for that. Scholarship tend to take a deeper view, a longer view. But I think more likely we've had some impediments that have misoriented our quest to understand the phenomenon. And I would like to point to a few of these, and hopefully these would be part of the conversation today. One, of course, is the imperative of national security and the dominant counterinsurgency paradigm of governance that, as the legal scholar Bernard Harcourt argued at Annenberg earlier this week, Western countries have imported this paradigm from their global military actions, and now it has become a mode of domestic governance. With such an approach, we prize speed and actionable information, and that subjects analysis to a couple of things that are, I think, not excellent conditions for scholarship. One is a compressed timeline of the national security state rather than the sort of more stretched temporality of scholarly expertise. And second, of course, is a very binary framing of all questions. We focus our analysis, or most of the analysis has been focused on, can we counter Islamic State? How do we counter it? Whether Islamic State is a state. Is it a state? Is it not a state? Is it Islamic? Is it not Islamic? Right? If we delete their Twitter accounts, do we counter them, or do we delete a very important source of data for us? So the questions tend to be very binary. I think this either or, neither nor, black or white approach obscures more than it enlightens. I don't think this is a controversial thing to say in a room full of academics. And yet, in response, we academics tend to wallow in endless shades of nuance, which often means that we analyze closely, we contextualize deeply, we compare broadly, but sometimes this means that we hide behind complexity, we obscure our thoughts with jargon, and we avoid reaching conclusions and making claims. I hope we can grapple with that issue a little bit more than usual today. I think we miss important opportunities to intervene in public discourse. And I do believe in the current global environment, with what's happening, with the upheaval, with hatred becoming institutionalized at the mainstream of societies that call themselves liberal democracies, with the rise of terrorism, with the rise of surveillance worldwide, I do think it has become an ethical obligation and a political necessity for scholars to intervene in the public sphere. This is something we hear a lot about, but I'm hoping we can find ways to do that better. I think a key challenge that we face today revolves around this question. How can we complicate how we understand a group like Islamic State, while at the same time expressing that complexity with clarity? I would like us to think a little more about that. For starters, we should question the absence of intellectual dissent when it comes to ISIS. A heavy consensus sees this as a terrorist organization embodying the deeper recesses of evil, filled with militants who are inhuman beasts whose sophistication in using media is nonetheless unprecedented. Right? The closest the debate has come to a fundamental disagreement about how to understand this phenomenon occurred in France. Right? For those of you who follow the Middle Eastern studies community in France is very divided. We have, on the one hand, the political scientist Gilles Kepel, on the other hand, the anthropologist Olivier Roy, who have slammed each other in French newspapers, on TV, and in academic publications. One is a proponent of the notion that seems to be dominant, which is that of the radicalization of Islam. But what Olivier Roy argues, in fact, is what we're seeing is an Islamization of radical spaces, which is the opposite. Now, we have with us here Joseph Philippe Salazar, who wrote a book, Paroles Armées, whose the English translation is available outside, who comes at this from a rhetorical analysis point of view, which I think tells us a lot more about ISIS identity and communication than bigger arguments. But I think we do need arguments. I think the absence of dissent in scholarship is a troubling phenomenon. And I hope we can find ways to sort of have some sparks today without throwing things at each other. So in my own work and at CARG, we have tried to understand ISIS as a war machine. The notion of the war machine is an arc of ideas that began with the 12th century Islamic polymath Ibn Khaldun, who wrote the famous Introduction to History, where he argued that the main way to understand how civilization evolves is to study interaction between people who move and people who stand still, between the nomads, the nomadic warrior in the desert, and the settled dynasties. About 400 or 500 years later, in a book that has become sort of a Bible in post-structuralist and vitalist circle, the French author Gilles Deleuze and Félix Guattari wrote 1,000 Plateaus, where they take back the notion of the war machine in their treatise on nomadology. And if you look at I think I've said this before, the footnotes of the treatise on nomadology basically speak with Ibn Khaldun. So there are two dialogues going on in the text, which I find extremely interesting. Islamic State is a spectacle. There's a counter-spectacle that attempted to counter it through body activism, through satire. I have argued in some writings that the way it creates territorial dominion is through event chains rather than only physical territorial control. And then it unleashes a peculiar kind of verbals and visuals that I dubbed the projectilic image, right? How can images function as projectiles, as bullets, as arrows? There's a very long tradition in Arabic poetry, for example, to create an aesthetic of the projectile, using things like swords and arrows, to talk about life in the desert, to talk about battle, but to also talk about love and its complications. Most importantly, the CARG research group has produced a bunch of writings that I encourage you to read. As I mentioned, they are online, free access. Just do CARG ISIS Media and you'll find them. With John Villanova, he and I have a book chapter coming out comparing the development of ISIS to the Mongol herds and the Khmer Rouge in Cambodia. And what we find is incredible similarity about their manipulation of space and time, incredible similarities about the fundamental role of communication networks in creating and sustaining identity and warfare, so on and so forth. Mohammed is presenting later today some of the work on the centrality of women, particularly non-Sunni Muslim women, in ISIS government procedures. Heather is presenting a project that's at the intersection of the Jinx group and the geopolitics of the popular group, talking about how television drama has represented ISIS, particularly Black Crows that Shireen talked about yesterday. As a center dedicated to global communication, I just want to end with a few specific lines of inquiry that I would like to flag. First, there's a question of affect and representation. In communication studies, there is a debate. You just have to look for it to find it. It's not it hasn't completely blown up yet. Between those who believe that communication is about conveying messages and those who believe that communication and media are about making us feel in certain ways. It's been presented as a debate between reason and emotion, representation and affect. Different traditions call it different way. But I think this is a fundamental tension in the field. This is a great opportunity to explore that tension. And I argue that we should systematically explore how ISIS's words and images make us feel, not only the information and messages that they convey. Point number one. Cliff Geertz said this years ago, that the essence of religious action is to impose authority on a complex of symbols. How do you impose authority on a complex of symbols? I think is a very important part of how ISIS communicate and how its enemies communicate against it. Second, we have the question of identity. I think we should look at communicative practices as identity information rather than expression of a prepackaged identity. And if I have one problem with a lot of the productions, the sort of writings about ISIS that have come out of analysts and think tanks, there's always the assumption, as Rafia flagged it very aptly yesterday, that somehow there's an identity that's preformed, that's ironclad, that's hermetically sealed, and it's distributed, disseminated through communication. Communication is not information transmission. Communication is about creating, sustaining, recreating, and shifting identities and worldviews as you go about your life. So in this sense, I think determining ISIS's identity is a very fraught issue. Determining, for example, whether it's Islamic or not, which is not a main concern of today. But that would require us to grapple with a very big question that Shahab Ahmad outlined in his magnum opus, What is Islam? Where he talked about figuring out, quote, the correspondence and coherence between one, Islam as a theoretical object or analytical category, and two, Islam as a real historical phenomenon. Third, and relatedly, what we prize at CARG is a comparative approach, a commitment to comparative research. What do we mean by this? This comes from my own interest, my own take on comparative research, but I believe comparative research needs to be comparative across historical periods, across geographical spaces, across media platforms, and across communicative styles. Particularly in the case of ISIS, if we're going to compare, we don't only compare it with the Khmer Rouge and the Mongols, but we compare it to a number of organizations that have emerged over the years in what Ahmed calls the Balkans to Bengal complex, the historical realm of Islam. In my own work, in addition to the Khmer Rouge and the Mongol herds, I found very striking comparisons with the digital productions, for example, of the Mexican narcos. I have some friends and colleagues working on this, and when we sit together and talk about it, the similarities are absolutely striking. The gore, the beheading, the blood, the ritualization of all of this, the music, specific kinds of music, the religious iconography, completely instrumentalized in the service of a violent agenda. they are more than just equivalent. So we need to look more in depth at these similarities. To this end, we come full circle to come back home for those of us in the US. Because one of the scarier things is when we imagine a group like ISIS to be something that's a distant phenomenon that we study. We did learn from Ahmed yesterday that there are environments where being a courageous journalist or a cultural producer means losing most of your family to violent death, right? But I think what's more troubling to me is that the more I work on this topic, the more I've been finding similarities between ISIS propaganda and white supremacist propaganda in the US and Europe. I just want to flag one issue, one essay that I'm working on right now about the use of elemental media like water and fire. If you look at the kind of symbolism that we see in the US from the Ku Klux Klan to the so-called alt-right, that we see developing a group like ISIS, you also see very chilling similarities. So unfortunately, this kind of violence backed with very sophisticated, attractive propaganda is closer to home than we think. So this is something to think about. To this end, our charge today is to grapple with some of the questions that are outlined in the program. I don't want to take more time. I want the first panel to start, but few quick questions. How does the group that calls itself Islamic State communicate? How has it been understood and contested? How has it been satirized, mocked, spoofed, resisted? And as I mentioned, we use the word mediation rather than media to shift the debate from a focus on specific technologies to a focus on processes of claim making, of identity construction, and of othering, right? So I hope we can have a very good conversation. I encourage all of you in the audience to participate, and I invite our first panel to the podium. I want to thank my colleague, Ann Norton, who's not only a distinguished scholar in political theory, but also is a very good friend of CARD. Thank you so much for agreeing to moderate the opening session. The floor is yours.
I'm also very eager to get to this opening panel. And you all have the biographies in the back of the material, so I'm not going to spend a lot of time on introductions. What I'm going to do is briefly introduce the panelists and make sure that they collectively leave time for discussion and questions, so I am your enforcer. And have you talked about what order you would like to go in?
Let's follow the order.
Okay, good. Well, the panelists are Roxanne Euben of Wellesley College, Brian Hughes of American University, Michael Krona of Malmö, and Philippe-Joseph Salazar of the University of Cape Town. So our first panelist, and I will sit there where you can clearly see me signaling that you are out of time. Sorry.
So good morning. It's a pleasure to be here today, and thank you all for coming so early. And thanks also to the organizers for making this possible. In the time I have today, I'd like to specifically focus on a fairly straightforward question. How has Daesh continually been able to bring into existence new audiences and devotees? And even more specifically, how is it able to continually summon adherents without the powerful draw of a caliphate that it has depicted as the only true home for virtuous Muslims? And despite military defeats that have undercut the lure of invincibility it has taken such great pains to propagandize, and with sharply reduced revenues from oil and taxes extracted from territories and populations it no longer controls, how is it able to continually conjure new adherents? Now, there are a number of ways to answer this question, but one consistently understudied route to answering it is through the visual and verbal rhetoric of ISIS video productions. And by this I mean a certain approach, approaching ISIS videos as, among other things, visual texts in need of close reading. This approach is different from the common analyses of such videos as strategic propaganda, that is, as tactics or a means to another end. More specifically, I want to argue that reading such videos along with their circulation as text rather than tactics, and as performative events rather than a means to an end, renders legible rhetorical practices and affective operations too long overlooked. In other words, I want to show by argument and example that one answer to the question lies in careful reading, not only of what such videos say, but also how they work affectively. And this picks up on a theme that Marwan just talked about, not just paying attention to the messages, but how they work affectively, emotionally. So by how they work, I mean specifically how they seek to visually and viscerally conjure new audiences and move them emotionally into a world directed by intense attachments and repulsions. Now, to make these arguments, I need to go narrower, given the time. And I'd like to turn to the videos of the beheadings of American journalists James Foley and Stephen Sotloff, first uploaded in August and September of 2014. Now, let me hasten to add, I don't focus on these videos because the lives of 2 white American men mean more than the innumerable others, many unnamed and unmourned, who comprise the majority of victims of Daesh violence. Rather, I focus on these because of the optics. These are the 2 most famous, or I should say infamous, ISIS videos among most Americans. Second, I focus on them because of the outsized political impact they've had on American-British policies and perceptions. And third, because they're particularly helpful in rendering legible one way that ISIS performs sovereignty symbolically, and I'll explain that momentarily. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus primarily on the execution scenes. And to begin with, I want to argue that approaching these videos as communicative acts in need of interpretation brings into focus a previously unrecognized disunity between the verbal and the visual rhetoric of these execution sequences. The verbal rhetoric of the videos largely hews to the logic of instrumental rationality, which has been the cue that has generated all the interpretations that regard these videos as tactics or means to a more important end. This instrumentalist logic is evident in the first words spoken by Mohammed Amwazi, the English-speaking executioner in both videos, the man the press once dubbed Jihadi John. As Amwazi makes clear, the beheadings are acts of retribution for American attacks on Daesh and Sinjar, each hostage leverage to make it stop. But the visual rhetoric conveys a different message that, as I'll argue in a moment, also works differently. Specifically, I want to argue that the visual rhetoric constitutes an enactment of retaliatory humiliation. And this is derived from my research on Islamist discourse, where humiliation is articulated as the imposition of impotence on Islam and Muslims by those with greater and undeserved power, while retaliatory humiliation both performs and produces an inversion of this relation of power. To show what I mean, let me turn to a reading of the videos and the execution sequences in particular. And here, because it's early in the morning, but at any time of day, this would be hard to take because it's fairly violent, so I just want to give you a warning. So the reading begins this way. Just consider the shorn heads of the captured men wearing bright orange clothing that deliberately refers to the jumpsuits worn by inmates at Guantanamo Bay prison. Positioned as if prepared for a rite of confession, they kneel in postures of submission at the feet of their executioner, who stands over them, legs apart, masked, clothed in black from head to toe, a serrated knife in his hand. The hostages are forced to use their last breath on earth to speak the words of their murderers. They say their nation, their president, they are the criminals whose rogue violence has placed them at war with Muslims. It is their country, their families, who have signed the death warrant of all Americans in ISIS's reach. As they speak, it's only the eyes that visibly hint at what had already been done earlier, outside the frame and unfilmed, to get each man follow the terms of this script, to play the designated role in the spectacle of his own murder. Then, with little prelude and even less ceremony, there's the quick move to the kill, the abrupt sawing motion at the front of the neck with the knife, much like slaughtering an animal. The quick camera cut to the prone body, severed head resting upon it. The slow pan down its length, steady, to reveal the cuffed wrists, the bare feet, and the painful vulnerability. The slow fade to black and then up, the killer now gripping the collar of the next kneeling victim as if holding an unclean animal. The threat and promise of an encore performance whose ritualized elements we now already know. The victims are forcibly and multiply exposed. Their names, their faces, their fear, their powerlessness, and their dead bodies are there for all to see. By contrast, virtually all specific aspects of the executioner's identity are hidden by the black garb of Daesh, a sign that itself requires a complicated reading, which I don't have time for. Now, there's one aspect the black garb doesn't cover, of course, and that's Mwazi's British accent, which denies English-speaking listeners any of the usually comforting signifiers of distance. All that's left to see and know of Mwazi is his maleness, height, stance, stillness, stiff delivery, and the apparent calm or even casualness he brings to the execution. And of course, there's the intimacy of the kill that he performs so efficiently. As studies have shown, it takes a particular kind of hardness to kill at close range and without a gun, where there's no escape from the pleas and screams of the victim, and far easier to kill at a distance with drones and bombs. With this reading, the question remains, how does this visual rhetoric work? That is, what does it do affectively? To begin with, I want to argue that this enactment performs and produces an inversion of power in two different registers. First, it performs ISIS's dominance through the symbolic emasculation of America. What the hostages are made to do, say, and wear, how their bodies are positioned both alive and when dead, all of these visual components are meant to convert the public subjugation and abjection of Foley and Sotloff into that of the American nation. In this way, the degraded and exposed bodies of the two men serve as public evidence and confirmation of the impotence of the United States. By the same token, the words, dress, positioning, and actions of Mwazi, along with the erasure of his specific identity, convert him into an emblem of the dominance, hardness, fearlessness, and invincibility of Daesh itself. As this makes clear, the mode of dominance here, the mode of brutality, is not random. On the contrary, and this is the second inversion, I want to suggest that the subjugation, abjection, and brutality are scripted and staged to ritually enact the signs and practices of sovereignty. And by sovereignty here, I mean something rather specific. I mean the power over life and death most often associated with political theorists such as Hobbes and Foucault. So this points to the second register. The videos as a whole stage a familiar confrontation between sovereign state and violent outlaw, rogue state, only to explode all settlements about who inhabits which position. While I don't have the time to go into the examples that demonstrate this, I'll be happy to do so during the question and answer. Now, I've just suggested that the visual rhetoric works symbolically. At this point, it's crucial to point out that these videos weren't produced to be passed hand to hand, viewed just once or twice by those somehow already sympathetic to Daesh. They were meant to circulate instantly, everywhere, and repetitively by way of digital networks. And this leads to the second sense of how these enactments work. Unlike still images, at least part of the ordeal of these men unfolds before our eyes in real time. And there's no shortcut through it, still capable of registering the event. And digital circulation just accelerates cycles of reception and reaction to such performances to unprecedented speeds, often heightening the intensities of online engagements with them. Repetitive circulation of such performances across digital platforms constitutes the events depicted as continually unfolding, rather part of an ongoing present rather than a completed past, and this is rather obvious. But in this way, watching can become an intensely visceral experience of witnessing, not in the sense of bearing witness to events that have already transpired, but in a semblance of eyewitnessing the violence as it actually happens. This sense of presence, of immediacy, I want to argue, is intensified by the particular content of these videos. And here I want to return to my point about humiliation. I've argued that an overlooked purpose of the visual violence in these productions is an enactment of retaliatory humiliation on the two hostages. I've also defined the relevant concept of humiliation as the imposition of impotence, that's hard to say, by those with greater and undeserved power. And this conception, again, comes from a close analysis of radical Islamist discourse. It's important and instructive at this point to translate this conceptual definition into experiential terms. Humiliation, I want to argue, based on this concept, humiliation lives in the rupture between one's own sense of significance and place in the social order and acute awareness of where others with more power have forcibly placed us. This means that humiliation, even a rehearsal of one's humiliation publicly after the fact, is rarely just a simple recounting of the events, but a reenactment of this rupture, one capable of revivifying the experience itself. The same is true of retaliatory humiliation, only in this instance, what's enacted, reenacted, and potentially revivified is a deeply restorative experience. A reclamation of power from those responsible for your powerlessness. A reinscription of humiliation on one's humiliator that simultaneously recuperates and vindicates one's own sense of significance in the social order. I want to suggest that this combination of content, which I've just described in experiential terms, and digital repetition, not just the speed, but the repetition, makes available the vicarious experience of witnessing the humiliation and an extended sense of being virtually implicated in it to millions of people across the globe. For some, it cultivates an even deeper affective enmeshment of spectator and performance, one where the watcher witness interpolates him or herself into the enactment itself, either as the humiliator or as the humiliated. This can involve taking on the humiliation and suffering of the victim, or alternatively, of relishing a profoundly restorative experience. More specifically, I want to suggest that such visual rhetoric is meant to work affectively on three differently situated audiences. The first is American men meant to be humiliated by the public emasculation of their male compatriots. This is to be accomplished in part by facilitating a visceral identification of American men with the abjection and pain of the hostages. Through such visceral attachment, the act of simply watching the videos is intended to force American men to actually experience the impotence and rage of being utterly powerless to intervene in a horrific event of the past that digital repetition continually offers up as an experience of the present. Second, this very performance of American humiliation aims to hail audiences from among the millions globally who harbor deep resentment at American power, offering them continual satisfaction and even pleasure. Third and finally, such rhetoric seeks to summon Sunni mujahideen from Norway to the US, interpolating them as ISIS's army-in-waiting through an effective identification with Mwazi's calm, fearlessness, potency, and purported piety, inviting them to share vicariously in the inversion of power and status he enacts in the videos over and over again. To conclude, a close reading of the visual rhetoric and effective operations of these videos can reveal how such practices seek to constitute their audiences by the very visceral power of their address. Of course, this doesn't mean that the videos are somehow inherently successful. What this analysis does suggest is that such power doesn't depend upon the existence of an actual state, which we all know. Instead, it works by anchoring emotional resonances deep in the domain where bodily responses join affective judgments, the domain where the piling on of countervailing evidence rarely holds sway. Thanks very much.
Yes, thanks, and thanks to all my colleagues, my co-panelists, my fellow Jinx scholars, Marwan and Marina especially, and all of you here today. I'm going to speak today on the topic of self-radicalized lone wolves in this, our digital age, and of two dominant discourses which claim to understand and describe what is meant when we say Islam in the term Islamist extremism. From there, I want to share with you a third potential emerging discourse, one of hypertext, that I believe speaks most directly to this lone wolf phenomenon. But let me begin with the first prevailing discourse. This first discursive position characterizes the extremism of ISIS and its ilk as a perversion of Islam. In fact, that specific word, perversion, and its inflected variants appear almost without fail through the literature of this discourse. And this is to describe a theo-ideology that takes as its point of departure the scripture and practice of so-called legitimate Islam, and through a process of misinterpretation and over-literalization, misdirects its adherents toward a illegitimate and violent fringe. Speeches by politicians including Barack Obama, Hillary Clinton, George H.W. Bush, now former National Security Advisor H.R. McMaster, have all typified this discourse using, in fact, this very term of perversion. And it is also to be found in a vast body of think tank-produced literature and a veritable subgenre of Islamic exegesis that came about directly in response to ISIS. And it's no coincidence, I believe, that this discourse may be found in a media environment of white papers, teleprompter scripts, highbrow periodicals, and books. That is, an ecosystem which is dominated by highly literate academics, theologians, and technocrats. The salient characteristics of this discourse, interpretive linearity and logical argumentation, coupled with deference to the authority of the text, are those that are intensified within the ecosystem of typographic media. And I must stress that typographic media do not determine these cognitive modes, however, they do seem to tend to favor them. Alongside those individuals and institutions I just mentioned, these media are partly and perhaps even largely constitutive of an episteme which produces this discourse of an Islam that has gone too far. The descriptor perverse, I think, captures this perceived process in a valence that summons both the moral admonition of religious authority and the psychotherapeutic paternalism of the secular Western political leadership. The ISIS recruit follows a misinterpretation here, a distortion there, an over-literalization somewhere else, and sooner or later he loses the plot of true Islam entirely and finds himself irredeemably far out, theologically and geopolitically, on a battlefield in northern Syria or Iraq. At the same time, we may identify a contrasting discourse that posits violent extremism as the truest expression of Islam. This discourse predominates among both extremists, such as ISIS, and Islamophobes alike. If the discourse of an Islam gone too far emerges from an episteme integrated along typographic communicative lines, this contrasting discourse emerges from a communicative ecosystem characterized by post-literate orality. On one hand, this ferment is the domain of ISIS's famously cinematic video dispatches, the widely shared speeches of, say, an Anwar al-Awlaki, and the culture of jihadi poetry and a cappella song described by the likes of Cresswell, Haeckel, and LaHood. On the other hand, this is also the province of right-wing talk radio, so-called new atheist podcasts, YouTube vlogs, and so on and so forth. In both cases, it is a discourse that bears the hallmarks of orality as identified by Walter J. Ong, wherein truth is not derived by logical inference from a point of textual departure, but rather it is sought in a moment of pre-enunciative purity, in an essence that the spoken word cannot help but corrupt, even as it bridges the abyss between essence and existence. A symmetry emerges between this post-literate discourse and the neurotic anxiety against multiplicity demonstrated both by ISIS in its loathing for democracy and its dreams of a global Ummah, and its reactionary critics who desire to rid the West of Muslim adulteration. In either case, it is a unity that is sought, one which is always already lost, but must nevertheless be restored no matter the cost. Now, both of the preceding discourses have their applications. The post-literate enunciative discourse offers real insight into the self-justification of ISIS members. It supports a growing body of literature that has drawn parallels between the psychology underpinning both right-wing and Islamist extremism. And it can help us to recognize when the self-reported justifications of jihadists or the far right are uncritically repeated by journalists and scholars. For its part, the linear typographic discourse does accurately depict the ideological rationale of certain highly literate extremists. De-radicalization strategies based on the assumptions of this linear typographic mode of discourse have reported some successes. And as a rhetoric of opposition against groups like ISIS, one which simultaneously affirms Islam and Muslims, it is, perhaps, for the time being, good enough. However, I would argue that neither discourse is well suited to understanding or describing the lone wolf who has self-radicalized with significant use of online resources. And it is precisely this figure whose violent outbursts are coming to characterize, in the US at least, our post-Caliphate dispensation. So, in lieu of these, I would propose that a new discursive mode is called for. This new discursive modality should be based on an understanding of the media and communication technology that characterizes the lone wolf's process of radicalization in the non-local, yet contiguous multimedia networks of digital communication technologies, the internet in general and the World Wide Web in particular. Here, the process of ideological and theological accretion, which we take as markers of radicalization, are rhizomatic, that is, without center, constantly changing shape. All points are potentially conterminous, and any point may constitute a rupture, a beginning, a link, or a dead end. The hypertext, like the rhizome, expands and shifts shape as it moves through space and time. It contains infinite paths blazed by each individual user and reader. The process of reading hypertext is therefore a process of writing by selection. Each click produces a new axial point, which aggregate as a straying, arbitrary zigzag of belief, taking the lone wolf through illogical and even contradictory ideological watersheds. And yet these disparate points do, in fact, adhere by virtue of some attractor pertaining to the lone wolf. That attractor, I claim, is affect. And I use affect here in Deleuze's sense. This is a hard thing to put into only a few words, as it describes, or seeks to describe, a thing that prefigures speech. But I think Masumi summarizes it well as a prepersonal intensity corresponding to the passage from one experiential state of the body to another. That is, as a kind of libidinal flux that occurs at the site of encounter between two things. In this case, between the lone wolf and the axial points of the hypertext. As the lone wolf half encounters, half conjures these axial points within the hypertext, the pre-emotive intensities that characterize his pathology gradually accrue what we may call a theo-ideological carapace. Its encrusted theologies and ideologies may clash, they may contradict, and given the qualities of the hypertext, this is almost inevitable. Yet, nevertheless, they hang together. No case better exemplifies these odd, straying intricacies than that of Omar Mateen, who in June of 2016 committed the then worst mass shooting in U.S. history at the Pulse nightclub in Orlando, Florida. Mateen, by turns, claimed membership in Hezbollah, pledged solidarity with al-Qaeda and al-Nusra, and dedicated his final act of violence to ISIS. He sought employment and law enforcement and security, and yet he railed against the application of American state power to family and coworkers. How to reckon these associations? An explanation of mental illness is problematic. Mateen bore no diagnoses, and furthermore, since such explanations tend to naturalize apparatuses of power, which work to the detriment of countering violent extremism, they should perhaps be avoided. The extent to which Mateen's pathologies might or might not have enjoyed any form of social sanction had he never acted violently is indeed important from the perspective of developing de-radicalization strategies. But insofar as understanding the process of his radicalization is concerned, that is, his straying, zigzagging accrual of contradictory identifications and ideologies, it is the trajectory of affect that is important. Deleuze suggests in Nomadology that the process of exteriorization might render affect more violent and unpredictable. The FBI has confirmed that Mateen was radicalized at least partly, which is to say, perhaps totally, online, and the ensuing years have not turned up alternative sources for his radicalization. Mateen, it seems, enacted the exteriorization of his affect in large part through the productive reading of the hypertext document, passing through loci of affection, gradually accruing a theo-ideological crust, which concluded in the bloodshed at Pulse. Other specimens of the hypertextual lone wolf, odder still than even Mateen, are beginning to emerge. Manharon Monis, here, was an astrologer and naturopath who took a Sydney coffee shop hostage in the name of ISIS. This is Devin Arthurs, who was a member of the Atomwaffen white supremacist group, who declared a newfound Muslim faith and promptly murdered his neo-Nazi roommates before taking a Tampa Bay head shop hostage. Here we even see the Parkland shooter, Nicholas Cruz, who we can find photographs of wearing a Donald Trump MAGA, Make America Great Again hat, and yet was reported to the FBI by a family member for being, quote, just so into ISIS. The list goes on, and it seems to grow every week. Now, a hypertextual discourse of the theo-ideological inflections of lone wolves like Omar Mateen and these others will, of course, no more explain them away than Quranic exegesis could explain away the likes of an al-Baghdadi or el-Zawahiri. However, what I hope the development of opening this vein of research can accomplish is, first, to further divide the actions and professed beliefs of mass killers like Mateen from the beliefs and practices of Islam. Second, I hope it could rob groups like ISIS of figures like Mateen, whom they might otherwise seek to incorporate into their media spectacle. And then third, one might hope that this could underscore the ornamental dimensions of theo-ideology so as to shift the overall discourse of countering violent extremism further onto root causes and away from superficial characteristics. The lone wolf radicalizes not through a perverse interpretation of Holy Writ, spun out violently to extremes. Nor is his path a return to some divine center or ideological essence from which the words of Holy Writ are mere echoes. But as the process of online self-radicalization progresses, it assumes characteristics of the communications media through which it is enacted. The theology and ideology of the lone wolf in the hypertext is a mask of contradiction, which adheres to a toxic affect that hurtles from its source to its final violent end. To fully understand it, we must understand it in relation to the media environment which participates in its production. Thank you.
Yes, thank you, and good morning, everybody. Thank you for inviting me, Marwan, Marina. I came all the way from Sweden, and I'm still a bit jet-lagged, but I'm not going to use that as an excuse for too much. So I will present the collaborative media practices and strategies that ISIS official and their supporters are using on the platform Telegram. And I work as a senior lecturer in media and communication studies, and I have been monitoring Islamic State since early 2014. And I started off as I had an interest in the social media activism in the uprisings during the Arab Spring. And I was interested in the shift of our view of technology and the perception of the celebration of technologies that dominated in the Arab Spring. And it was interesting for me to see how ISIS came along and used the same social media that has been celebrated in a completely different way. So I started looking into it, and I started off with the content and propaganda, and I had downloaded a lot of material, which is not so popular among the Swedish security police necessarily, but I have created an archive by myself of all their official videos in particular. But after working on the content for a while, I was starting to become more interested in the strategies for creating and forming identities that has an inclusive sort of dimension that makes their digital supporters to feel like they are part of the organization. So I started looking into the strategies of not only dissemination, but also identity construction. And the choice of using the platform Telegram is actually a result of the deliberate shift from more open social media platforms into Telegram in particular that has a more encrypted function. Some of the things that I will show you here will be new to some of you and will be very familiar to others. But my research currently is based on monitoring daily around 100 channels on Telegram that are both supporter channels and official channels. And I think the most interesting in ISIS use of Telegram as a platform currently is the fact that it has the ability to establish a multi-purpose channels, strengthening the propaganda machine and also the relationship to its supporters. It's very crucial, I believe, that it allows ISIS affiliates that are latently connected to the central hubs of the organization to receive and share a coherent, centralized propaganda message strategy, as well as establish encrypted communication channels and communication between each other and individuals. I also believe that IS has enforced a new communication paradigm within the jihadist spheres of extremist communication, partly because other groups have also implemented this type of model for not only dissemination, but also identity building and formation. IS has also, much due to the outreach of its propaganda, created a new set of ballgame for countering extremist content online. And the architectural structure of Telegram is a fundamental reason for this. And therefore, I also dig deeper into this systematic use of the platform from a collaborative perspective. For this event and for this article that I have provided for this symposium, I have worked with a data collection strategy of digital ethnography, and I have infiltrated or used covert observation of these channels and groups, both official and supported channels. My aim has been to understand the infrastructure, the platform itself, and the channels, the accounts, and the strategies that they are using, with a particular focus on the collaborative practices between official and non-official and supporters. The data consists of screenshots of digital strategies, observation records, and downloading a lot of propaganda content. And as you can see here also, I have for this article and for this research, I have monitored in total of 87 channels. There is a, I would say, an interesting methodological dilemma when researching. I'm sure this is very familiar to many of you here. I would say for me personally, it has a security aspect that has been difficult because, and it's also an ethical aspect that is difficult to come around as a researcher. Being invited into these groups, and it's, yeah, it has a methodological challenge that maybe we can discuss further on. The theoretical framework from which I try to understand this material is based on two fundamental trajectories. The first one would be on understanding collaborative media practices. And as I said, my focus has been on understanding the relationship between supporters and official outlets, and see what type of practices and strategies are dominant and how they are related to each other. From a more sociological point of view, I'm interested in the concept of sociospheres, which was presented by Krieger and Belliger, among others, within the actor network theory framework. And I think when it comes to the functions of Telegram and the possibilities that groups like ISIS have on Telegram when it comes to private communication, private to public, as well as public to public communication possibilities. The concept of a sociosphere, which is an extension of the Habermas public sphere theory. The sociospheres are in this case a result of online communication technologies and development, and it has the possibilities of creating a dynamic setting for, in this case, supporters within the ISIS virtual universe. So I'm going to show you some themes of analytical themes that I, and some data that I have collected. The first one is the official practices of ISIS communication. You can see there, but the left, to the left, you have an AMAC, a news agency Telegram channel, which presents the news and updates. These blue banners are updates and claims of attacks or in general news updates. They are also published, as you can see to the right, in another official channel and network, which is the Nashir channels. So there is a cross-publication of AMAC news agency's content. Nashir channel to the right also publishes the official propaganda. AMAC to the left does not. It's just the news aspects. But I think it's a strong trajectory of a very centralized messaging which enhances the brand of ISIS. It enhances the trustworthiness of their news and their claims. And I think another reason for that is the fact that we have journalistic outlets and mainstream media that also have sort of starting to adopt and to take and legitimize AMAC news agency, which is the non-official news agency of ISIS, legitimize it by treating it as a trustworthy news source. And I think that is problematic from a larger journalistic and media framework. But the official practices are fundamental in their centralized messaging. The second theme I would like to show you is the concept of decentralized communication practices and centralized communication practices. As you can see here we have a official video that is being presented, being uploaded and published on around 30 to 40 links by supporters. And there is this, every time there is an official video, this happens in a lot of channels, which gives it an extensive outreach when it comes to the official propaganda. And also, I would say, in addition, that the supporters' engagement with the official material, just the fact that uploading it on new links, that also is important when it comes to feeling part of this organization and part of the official messaging. It puts focus on the relationship between the official channels and the non-official. Not least, it is visible since I has recently pushed in official channels, they published a statement saying that don't trust anything that doesn't come out of ISIS official channels. So when it comes to news updates, for instance, it is important for them to maintain this mainstreaming function and credibility to have it, that the news and information coming out of the official channels, that is the one that is the significant one. So the third theme is just to show you the interconnectivity and multi-account platform publication. I use the concept of core accounts and credibility nodes, which are accounts that are placed in the middle between the official and digital supporters, general digital supporters. And you have core accounts that has high credibility, they have quite a lot of followers, and they have a very strong presence on Telegram. And these core accounts, whenever there is an official product coming out, in this case, as you can see, the newspaper Al-Naba, these core accounts publish simultaneously as the official outlet to the left. A core account publishes the same product and the same sort of extracts from the official propaganda product. You can't see on the screen, but the timing here is interesting because it is published at the exact same minute. Which also suggests that there is not only manual labor, there is also a non-human communication aspects involved here. But it has this interconnectivity and cross-channel publication that is important to understand when it comes to the relationship between official and non-official channels. Another one is also to show how these core accounts also regularly publishes links to the official Nashir channel accounts as well, to maintain the Telegram presence and to maintain the outreach and spread of their propaganda. The final theme is about the engagement and participation within pro-IS supported channels. So you have a sort of a collaborative and ideological incubation, I suggest to use as a term, where supporters are creating their own material and propaganda, almost like an artistic competition between each other, and it creates a dynamic setting within the supporter channels to have this type of visual expressions. And I think these posters that usually contains threats of different kinds, I think they are less important when it comes to the content of the posters. Rather, it's more important to look at them as visual expressions of this process of identity formation that is cultivated within IS channels on Telegram, and supporters channels on Telegram. It also, as I said earlier, makes the incentives of engaging with the material quite interesting. And within these supporter channels in particular, there's also discussions among around religion, around ideology, around threats, or whatever type of content that it could be of interest. And I think there is this cultivation function. I usually compare it to understanding extremist environment in the physical world. I think we have a lack of understanding of the digital environments when it comes to understanding how identity formation is built. Also an example of the engagement with official material. So you have supporter accounts who are linking and generating Twitter accounts with extracts of official video productions to market the video. on this multi-platform sort of approach. And finally, also see that there is a huge rise of creating new Telegram channels that are niched and very specifically directed for a certain purpose, whether it's inspiration videos or whether for attacks or whether it's advice and training for so-called lone wolf attacks. And I think this rise of creating these type of new channels is also a fundamental sort of challenge for the international community to be able to counter. And the conclusions that I have evolves around, and I noticed in Marwan's opening statement here that the concept of identity, I believe, and I agree with Marwan, that this is not a fixed one. It is an identity that is formed in a process. It is largely, as I said here, manufactured or enhanced through an intricate and collaborative use of media platforms, not least Telegram. And it contributes to the cultivation of ideological meaning and belonging. And I think from a media research point of view, the interconnected network strategies applied on Telegram, it creates the dynamics of a contemporary digital terror sociosphere in which the symbiotic relations between these accounts and individuals generate not only the outreach and exposure, but also empowering supporters to very active participatory media collaborations. And as a media researcher, I also usually conclude and finish by saying that I believe that there is a lack of transdisciplinary approach. I think there is a great need for different disciplines and academic fields to come together. As a media researcher, I can only say so much about content. I can say so much about the strategies. But I also need sort of influence and understanding and frameworks and perspectives from other fields like technology studies, software engineering, as well as Middle Eastern studies or religious studies, terrorist security conflict studies, and sociology. And I think that this symposium actually is a good example of where we come in from different disciplines. So thank you very much for listening.
Right. So I'm not jet lagged, but I'm French, which is quite similar. We have a long knowledge of terror in France. We invented it, as you know, and the Glorious Revolution had a cost of 500,000 dead, which we nearly repeated in 1945. We are very violent people. And we think that terror was really the acme of the French Revolution, the purest moment of the advent of democracy. And that's food for thought, I think. So I'm not going to read the text. I'm going to read from my notes. I'm going to switch on my 15 minutes now. Start, if it wants to start. It doesn't want to start. Oh, that's odd. Okay. Technology for you. I'm going to talk briefly about the enduring nature of the Caliphate. The Caliphate has been pushed outside its natural territory, the Middle East, but it has entered what I call the long time of Islam, what has been called the government of God. It is part now of the hagiography of Islam. Whether we disagree or not agree with it doesn't matter. In 500 years, it will be part of the long history of Islam. It's undeniable. It's not for us either to decide whether it's perverted or perverse Islam, whether it's true or not true Islam. It is simply a historical fact. And it is due partly, I think, this enduring, in a Heideggerian way, I'm a philosopher, call that standing in time. It's partly due to what I call the literacy of the Caliphate. It's highly erudite culture. To understand the literacy of the Caliphate, I would like, for the purpose of today's chat, to look at the illiteracy of our media and our political class, our professional political class. That is how we've put in place discourse procedures to try and understand what I would call the incomprehensible. All my life I've worked, well, I haven't got a foot in the grave, you know, but for 40 years I've been working on incomprehensible events like apartheid, for instance, and other aspects, and now the Caliphate. And I would like, for the purpose of today's conversation, highlight 5 discourse procedures which, in my view, give us an entry in what I call the illiteracy of our understanding of the Caliphate. I was rapped on the knuckle, as it were, with the French ambassador last week when at a meeting I said Caliphate. He said, no, Daesh. I said, yes, it is what your minister says, but I don't need to speak the language of your minister. I like Caliphate. And as I said one day on the BBC, Caliphate resonates with the culture that we've had at school, if we went to school, that is. We've had Caliphate before. Up to 100 years ago, we had the Ottoman Caliphate on our, on our doorstep. So it resonates with European culture. ISIS doesn't resonate. ISIL doesn't resonate. IS, what is IS? But Caliphate evokes things in our culture. So my first point is about our sovereignty over language. And I will take 2 examples. How we've lost sovereignty on our own language when we try and speak about the Caliphate. First example is when the Caliphate was declared, that absolutely gorgeous homily of foundation on the 4th of July. On the day of the foundation of America, the Caliphate founds its own state. An incredible you must realize that the speech on the 4th of July, the foundation speech of the Caliphate, was in fact a speech on the state of the Islamic nation worldwide. And it was designed just for that. Well, immediately the press and then the politicians who are, as we know, extremely literate, talked about self-proclaimed caliphate, self-proclaimed. But lo and behold, since the 18th century, we do know that the only way for a nation or a people to declare independent is to self-declare. You do not ask anyone else to proclaim you independent and sovereign. You self-declare. You declare that those truths are self-evident. Well, they were not self-evident for the British or the French, when your own republic was created. There was nothing self-evident about it. The self-declaration is a major tenet of the culture we have inherited from Locke and Montesquieu. You self-declare. However, and still nowadays, you can hear these rhetorical commonplace that it is worthless, or it was worthless, because it was self-declared and self-proclaimed. And then I turn it around, and you witnessed in French and also in English or in German what I call the Arabization of the vernacular. Suddenly, without accents and all the diacritical signs, everyone was talking about Sharia, about Allahu Akbar. Never heard of it in French before. It was always Allah Akbar, but suddenly wanting to have this. Sharia, Allahu Akbar, Allah. And what surprised me as someone who interrogated a philosopher our sovereignty over language, why can't we say God? The terrorists said God is great. The effect, if we want to combat jihadism, is to take from them their language and say, he killed, shouting, God is great. This would force them actually to redefine what God is. That's my first point. 2 quick examples. I believe in being in rhetoric, in artifacts. The second point will be what I would call the sovereignty over our personal mediation. I'm going to explain that. Images of terror and sounds of terror are not in the public sphere. You and me, we've been looking at videos. At the beginning, we wanted to go onto Gore sites, in fact, to find them. But the general public hasn't seen execution videos, hasn't really heard what Coptic Christians were shouting at the moment of the execution, Jesus, Jesus, which condemned them radically to death. The media have practiced what Foucault calls commentary. Even this morning, it's not criticism of you, you didn't show us the video. And that has been the standard practice, voicing over, blurring images to the point of the execution, and then using commentary. Instead of making us listen to what they are saying, The reporter would voice over and comment. That's one of the procedures of controls that Foucault talks about. In other words, the general public, not you and me, cannot either bear witness or be witness of the event. The general public, and these are the people who matter. We don't matter, but the public, our compatriots do matter. They've never seen an execution. And very few of them have the wherewithal or the patience to go onto various sites, to go and look. I wrote one of the very first articles in France about the executions, and the title was "Silence, They Are Slitting Throats." And I took a very banal, as you mentioned, execution in a street of I think, of Mosul. Many of my friends couldn't bear actually watching it. So there is a reluctance among us who have practiced through colonization and other misdeeds, practiced violence, this inability to witness the reason why we should combat jihadism. So the second procedure of control. We do not want to witness the reality of it. The third procedure of control, what I call religious sovereignty. Two narratives. I use the word. I don't like the use of the word narrative by security agencies and so on, because they don't know what they are talking about, actually. But that's another matter altogether. And this is why they're winning hearts and minds. Never win any heart and any mind, except that the opponents are truly convinced that they have heart and mind. Two narratives are in conflict. The narrative we hear all the time is what I call a security narrative, radicalization. We never or hardly hear in the press, again, I'm not talking about us intellectuals, in our little chapels where we talk among each other. Sometimes we have an impact on the public, and the mainstream newspapers, Conversion. The young men and the young women, they're from Western Europe, who never had a religious life, never believed in God, totally secularized Germans or French, not only convert to the idea of God, but they convert to Islam. That is, they basically do the process. They don't go through Abraham and Jesus to Mahomet. They go straight to the fulfillment of the advent of God on earth in due time. Conversion is something we cannot deal with in our secularized society. Conversion to faith is often ascribed to extreme evangelists, for instance, or to orthodoxies of religion. But we cannot bring ourselves in public discourse to talk about conversion to faith. And from faith goes the inability to argue. You cannot argue with a true believer because the premises of his argument are untouchable. They cannot be challenged. You can only challenge the implementation from the premises, but not the premises. Therefore, with conversion, what you have individuals who step outside public debate and public argument, which is really the mainstay of democracy, exchanging ideas and accepting that you don't agree with me, but we can come to an agreement. And that very important part of being a democracy has been erased through that third procedure by mentioning radicalization, but not wanting to talk about conversion. Conversion is a beautiful word, whether it is in Hebrew or in Latin. It means turning back to God and turning back to the community that has excluded you, and you must now reconcile and repent. And many of the narratives, as you know, the stories of the jihadists, is that they have found their human community again. As you know, their texts are full of love and friendship and camaraderie, something which you don't find in the media. The fourth procedure, it's what I call linear causation. I happen to be a professor in a law school, so I have to do that, so I can earn my salary, but yes, in the law, Linear causation. As you have noticed, whenever there is a terror attack, the newspapers and the police and the security agencies, they want a claim. They want the central command, wherever it is nowadays, to claim the act of terror. This is a legal police type of linear causation. There is the act, you want the evidence, you want the motive. They never realize that This type of causation, and that was touched on in two papers before, it's a different logic which is at work in a terrorist act. What I mean here is that the claim, there's either a search for a claim, and the search for the claim is to justify the action. When the claim by the Caliphate comes 2 or 3 days later, and they are very smart at delaying the claim and at playing on different claims and different type of explanation, it is presented usually by security agencies as an a posteriori justification. Others, I think, analyzed as I have analyzed in my book, but in the English version, the French version doesn't contain that chapter. I think the German version has it also. I explain how after the Paris attack in November, the claim was phased in step by step, very meticulously, so that the commando attack against Paris, because it was a commando attack very well planned against Paris, was followed over a period of 2 months by a media commando attack with a phasing of releases in various languages. The causation of the act of attacking the stadium in Paris and the various, the Bataclan and so on, was expressed in the first victory communique. I call that a victory communique because I believe it's a war and there are armies in presence, in which using 4 or 5 surahs, they read the event through a series of surahs, and if you look at the book, I'll give all the details. But it's not, the explanation by the surahs is not an explanation of the action. It is the arranging of the surah that commanded the action. So if we get stuck in a legal way, we're going to say, this is an explanation of how the action took place. But if we work in a eschatological or faith-based explanation, we'd say, it is the alignment of surahs that leads to the assembly of the true people on the Friday that commanded and framed the attack in advance. It is very difficult for us to cast ourselves in that kind of frame of understanding. And I've got a couple of minutes left. The number 5, it's what that I call the 5th discourse, is what I would call, there are 2 logics at work. Let me encapsulate the difference by saying that jihadism and the caliphate is a form of populism. There is a jihadist people, and some security agencies in Europe think that there might be an insurrection one day. I mean, the sheer mass in Britain, for instance, of possible jihadists can indeed lead to an insurrection. I don't go that far. My argument is different, and it's based essentially on Ernesto Laclau explanation of the populist reason. If you read the press, if you read what the security agencies are saying or feeding the press, actually, terrorism, Islamic terrorism, is manageable. And we manage each terror attack separately. We deal with this terrorist, with that terrorist, for that reason and this reason. The reasons are usually family trouble, social exclusion, no job, it's a thug, it's a criminal. Of course, there are criminals in any army. The foot soldier is not a very bright spark, but they never tell us about the cadres. The cadres do matter, and you know how long it took for the French and Belgian police to catch, in fact, the captain in charge of the commando that attacked Paris. He's being tried now, very bright boy. But this is how politics is functioning nowadays. We are being managed. The grievance of the teachers in Kentucky can never be linked to the grievances, say, of a mining community near Pittsburgh. We manage a crisis at a time. That's the logic of management in politics. If you apply that to terrorism, you realize that what is happening with Islamic terrorism, and that we saw with the hypertext, wonderful presentation, it's a logic of aggregation, and I'm using Laclau's idea here, that my grievance as an individual who is looking for transcendence using the internet relates suddenly to a grievance or an attitude of some individual somewhere else. And then a chain of aggregation is being created. This is how Laclau explained a revolutionary popular movement, a chain that aggregates grievances of people who are not actually related. It's from individual to the high literacy of the propaganda of the Caliphate. Think about it. It's the first global ideology that uses the internet. Imagine if communism had the internet 20 years ago. But the internet means also that the literacy, the library of the Caliphate is here to remain forever. And I don't think we've weighed really the importance of that. It is there, it is active. Jean-Paul Sartre, in the critic, to finish on that, of Critical of Dialectical Reason, he talked about fraternity terror. The chain of aggregate create a fraternity that justifies terror. I will end on that because I've exceeded my time. Thank you very much.
Thank you. My name is Lina Khatib. I'm the head of the Middle East and North Africa program at Chatham House in London. My question is to Professor Salazar. I find it a bit problematic that you are choosing to use the word caliphate over Daesh. Of course, the organization itself doesn't like the word Daesh. It calls itself Islamic State or Caliphate, but that's not the reason why you're choosing it. You're saying that Caliphate is chosen because it resonates in Western culture, because it refers back to previous caliphates in Islam. I find this problematic on many levels. One, because this is still about prioritizing Western kind of intellectual frameworks, I guess, over any other, because you're saying you want something that resonates in the West, and therefore this is the choice based on a Western cultural preference. That itself is obviously, when it comes to linking the notion of the so-called caliphate of ISIS with the caliphates of Islam before, I'm not saying that ISIS is not connected to Islam, it's not about that, but to kind of present it as something that is in the same framework, I find it highly problematic, because they are not really ideological. They are an organization that uses ideology for power. And so in a way, by choosing to kind of prioritize the word caliphate, I find that you're falling into the same, into the trap that they have created, instead of challenging it. Whereas I feel if we call them Daesh, it's good to piss them off, in my view. But regardless of that, why focus on a word that ends up emphasizing their message?
There's a lot in what you said. I'm also a member of Chatham House, another simple member, not a researcher. Why do I say caliphate? Because we can only speak the language we speak. I use English and I use French. And my language, or the two languages I practice others too, refer to a doxa and a set of rhetorical commonplaces. It's far easier to explain the prevalence of that organization if we refer it to historical references. The problem, and I'm always looking at not us intellectuals, but the common people, those who truly matter. You know, we are not intellectual, but to read the press and hear words. And usually a speech of 25 minutes is summarized in 2 seconds. I worry about them because they went to school. Let's speak about the French. I don't know if the Americans still go to school, but the French still go to school. You know, they've heard of the Caliphate. They know about the Ottoman Empire. They know about the massacres at the hands of the Ottoman empires right up to the First World War. So they have an idea of what has been the presence of a violent imperial power at the borders of Europe for let's say at least 4 centuries in the case of the Ottoman Empire. Therefore, if you want to convey the danger of that state that has now disappeared in the Middle East for the time being, it will come back, of course. It's the only way you can convey the same sense of urgency and danger if you use a vocabulary, a rhetorical stock of commonplaces that evokes notions and a knowledge. This is why I prefer Caliphate. Also, they call themselves a Caliphate. How can we deny them that self-qualification? It would be like denying the name Republic to the American Republic. You could say, I'm a citizen sovereignist, you know, that French group. This is not the Republic. I deny calling the American Republic. I think we live in a world of facts and realities, and if they call themselves a caliphate, it is a caliphate. We don't have to pass judgment. So in fact, I'm even less Eurocentric than you think I am, because I give them what they want to be called. And Daesh is an invention of Foreign Minister Fabius in France, you know. So.
Yes.
I have a question on something else, but if you want to keep pressing on this, I'm happy to yield the floor.
No, not at all. I think we need to get a few questions.
So my question is, thank you. My name is Elizabeth. I'm a doctoral student here. I have a question for Brian, and first of all, great presentation. One thing that I wanted to know more about the lone wolf as a discourse is how masculine it is, right? So I'd like you to unpack a little bit what the masculinity of the lone wolf means.
This is actually the area that I'm beginning to look into right now, is this trying to discover some of these root causes, or the influences of the root causes of lone wolf violence. I think you have to look at the emotional lives of young men across different societies. I mean, obviously there are going to be cultural and social contexts that that alter those experiences. Yeah, I think that generally, you know, what I'm seeing is an intersection of material conditions pertaining to stability, disappointment, thwarted expectations professionally and socially, and then these sort of stunted emotional lives that young men in their teens and 20s in this sort of, I mean, it's a word people don't like, but in the context of global neoliberalism, young men in their teens and 20s have increasingly impoverished and difficult emotional lives. The most vulnerable and maybe toxic to begin with individuals are therefore kind of in this ideal set of circumstances, or a good set of circumstances, that through this process of accrual can often shoot them out in this trajectory that concludes in violence. Yeah, I absolutely think that masculinity, conceptions of it, practices of it, performances of it, however you want to look at it, is a crucially important dimension to the question overall.
My question is for Professor Euben. Excellent presentation. I was wondering if you would include the sort of Foucauldian contrast between punishment and execution as it is carried out, like in the Western world, where it's invisible and kind of taken away from the public realm, to this kind of public and gory, very intentionally medieval execution as perhaps one part of the analysis.
Okay, thank you. That's a good question. So first, I would have to say, as an important caveat, that one of the things that's tricky about invoking Foucault and his notion of punishment is that it positions this kind of public execution as something like a revenant of a kind of earlier past, whereas it's obviously quite contemporary. And what you put your hand on the fact that, you put your finger on the fact that, the modern liberal state engages in huge amounts of violence, many of it behind prison walls, hidden in all sorts of ways, hidden by rhetoric, hidden by euphemisms, And you can think about the very notion of the word decapitation and the way it's used to decapitate the heads of Al-Qaeda or ISIS. And I think what the dynamic that goes on there is the way ISIS is positioned is a way of, in fact, hiding more projecting that kind of violence onto ISIS as a way of also hiding the kind of collateral damage and the enormous amount of violence that Euro-American countries and the United States in particular have engaged in, and it's a way of sort of projecting it and sort of continually masking the kinds of violence that the modern liberal state and actually neoliberal globalization has enacted.
Thank you. Thanks to all of you. Fantastic presentations. My question goes to Brian, and then I have another one to Michael. Brian, could you please elaborate a little bit more on the concept of self-radicalization? As you've shown in your presentation, clearly these people establish relationships with other people through the net. So they don't meet in person in reality, but there's still a social relationship, right? And how do they really self-radicalize? Because to me, it seems that this concept insinuates that there is a potential to that is somehow born within the person, and then all this radicalization comes out of the person themselves, which I would find rather problematic. But isn't it not rather the case that the radicalization process is stimulated through social relationships taking place on the internet? Was that clear?
That can certainly be the case. I mean, Mark Sageman's group of guys model of radicalization, is socially contingent in that respect. I think I'm going to push back just a little bit and say that the time-binding elements of digital technology, the sort of hyper-mediatization of it, renders the question of what constitutes an interpersonal relationship very questionable. The fact of the matter is, dealing with a person who posted something on an image board 6 months ago, in a sense, you're interacting with that person's thoughts and their affects, sort of such as it's bound in that digital milieu. But you're not really having a relationship with that person in that kind of, in that Sageman group of guys, modality of radicalization, excuse me. Now, as to your point about whether certain people are more predisposed than others, I think that I guess I don't think it's a controversial statement to say that some people are more prone to criminality than others. I mean, we know how the experiences of trauma predispose people to antisocial or self-destructive or otherwise pathological behaviors. I mean, is this something that's sort of bred in the bone when you're born? I don't know, and I don't want to wade into that. But yeah, no, I think some people, and this goes back to this issue of masculinity and sort of the ways that it toxifies, some people are at greater risk than others. And certainly from a practical perspective, in terms of reaching young men before they commit these acts of violence, I think that there's a certain amount of triage that has to be done in terms of determining who is more at risk or who is a greater risk to the community, depending on how you want to look at it.
Thank you. May I just ask
No, you don't get one more because Marwan said I could only ask one more question, and he also gave me permission to ask it myself. And I want to ask a question which I think speaks to all the presentations, which is this part of what we're seeing here, the overcoming of the contemporary model of the state, or the Westphalian state, that I think that several of you, particularly Professors Euben and Salazar, pointed to the emergence of a non-territorial, unbounded form of allegiance and sovereignty that is both over and under the state. And I think there is a way of reading Professor Krona's presentation as providing the apparatus whereby this happens. And in a sense, I do think that Brian Hughes may be the outlier. that I'm not, that you're, the men that you called out, I concur with the gentleman in the back, that these people may not be alone, that they may be part of an emerging sovereignty that is not like the contemporary state. So I was hoping that each of you could, in conclusion, comment perhaps on that question.
Shall I start?
Please do.
Yeah, something I wanted to mention at the end of my chat was Lyotard's concept of the différent. What I find striking as a philosopher and political scientist is that we've had an idea of the state since the First World War. That is, they are states defined by the Montevideo Convention that dialogue with each other in the League of Nations and at the United Nations. And this is the idea of a state we have. Some of these states are not recognized by everyone, like Israel, as you know. There is a good deal of states at the UN who do not recognize Israel as a state. We have Kosovo. Is it a state or not? We don't really know. North Korea, is it rogue or not? But they all are states. This is a very new notion. What I find fascinating with the Caliphate is that we have emerging a new state that is using different means to establish itself, which is religious and transcendental. I think the conversion, I don't like radicalization, because I don't think it explains the conversion to faith and God and to ultimate ends, which is really what is happening. You know, these young men have epiphanies, and we better face it. A criminal can have an epiphany. In fact, the Bible is full of criminals having epiphanies. So it's a new type of state. And the concept of Lyotard différent is that that state doesn't litigate with us. It says, you actually do not exist. And they rename the rulers of various Arab and Muslim states. They call them governors. And I find that, as a political philosopher, quite fascinating. A new notion of state is emerging, which is different from what we've known for the past 100 years, and I think there'll be other cases. We better start grappling with that. We can't just send counterinsurgency agents after them. It ain't going to work.
Yeah, I agree. I think there is definitely a new form of understanding of the concept of state, and I think for ISIS, the whether or not they are accepted, or I think that's the whole point of not being accepted. It has enforced a certain notion of community for them. So as a media researcher, I find it interesting on several levels that the physical caliphate that they sort of established in 2014, the media has functioned as an amplifier of that state. And when that territory started diminishing, there were a lot of us, me included, thinking that their media operations would be changing as well and be diminishing in significance. But they have somehow managed to adapt to and be very flexible to the narratives surrounding the state, surrounding the caliphate, now entering an era of a post-nostalgic sort of caliphate that they need to avenge how the Western powers have ruined. And the media has an interesting, that's also what I wanted to underline in my presentation. It has an interesting inclusive factor that makes their supporters to identify and feel like citizens. So they're redefining the citizenship. And from a Swedish perspective, it's also quite interesting that a year ago we had an attack in Stockholm, our capital, where a citizen was running a truck down a pedestrian street. And in Sweden, we are very transparent, so we can read all the transcripts because he survived or failed to die, depending on how you see it. The transcripts of the interrogations with him for the last year, where he clearly states that he feels like a citizen of the Islamic State. And they have not claimed it. They have basically no idea who he is. But he had this very strong notion of being part of this state and the caliphate. And the wording is extremely clear when it comes to understanding the caliphate as a state, regardless of how the Western world in general looks upon them. So Yeah, I think I agree. I think we are entering a new form of understanding of the word of state.
I do think that there is a kind of distributed, non-local type of solidarity that emerges in some of these mass killers. And this sort of distributed, non-local solidarity, new way of conceiving, I don't know if it's entirely appropriate to call it a state, but it's a new modality of solidarity. I think ISIS absolutely is, going to be pinpointed as a pioneering force in that respect. If you look at some of these mass killers who are tied to these various and sundry and contradictory ideologies, a lot of them do express affinity for one another and view themselves as kind of, not brothers puts it too strongly, but they view themselves as of a sort. But I don't think that, I think it's premature to say that a Manharon Monis, a Nicholas Cruz, the YouTube shooter Nassim, her name escapes me, these people who I would all characterize as a sort of hypertextual lone wolf, I think it's premature to posit some kind of, organizational principle that exists outside of this general sense of affinity that they seem to have for one another.
Okay, so first I would just like to respond to the suggestion that all of these young men have converted and turned to God. I actually think studies show that the motivations are actually quite complicated and hybrid, and it's not always about conversion, and it's not always about devotion to God. So I would just like to introduce that. I think it's absolutely right. I think part of the reason, and Marwan referred to this, I think part of the reason that there is this premature declaration that ISIS has been defeated is because of a very narrow-minded notion of a kind of sort of flattening of sovereignty into territoriality and a flattening of state into territoriality. I mean, I think this is, I think ISIS's notion of a caliphate, like the historical one, really, I think, transcends regions. It's not necessarily brand new. It actually sort of evokes the notion of an ummah, and there are various different places and throughout the world that they've established outposts, suggest that it's much more consistent with the notion of a Muslim community that extends far beyond any particular region, far beyond particular borders and territories, and also reflects in many different ways. It is produced, or at least structured, by a neoliberal globalization. So in a way, it has taken on many of its characteristics in addition. So I think it both builds on a precedent and it's also a response to contemporary conditions.
Thank you all very much. I'll leave it there.